Okay. Hi, Irene. My name is Luisa Purvu. I'm one of the programmers at Mimesis. Welcome. We have another filmmaker with us in the room. This is the Q&A for Ctrl+S, documentary block. And I would actually like to start with you, Irene. I think it was a very powerful screening. At least this is how I perceived it. You know that this is a close subject to us as well here in the area. And we've been through a horrible fire not long ago. I'm wondering, when did you decide to make this film? At what stage? And I know you were part of the community. Do you still live there? What's the situation in that regard? Because you mentioned that you worked with your neighbors, and I would like to know more about the context, but also when did you feel the urge to tell this story? And yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear?
Yes.
So first I want to apologize. My neighbors are having some kind of like garage band rehearsal. So there's like really loud, like.
We can't hear, so no worries.
You might hear it in a minute. You'll see. I don't know if you can hear it. Anyway, it's loud.
No.
Okay, it's loud for me. Sorry about that. I'll try not to be distracted. Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for that context. I think a thing I want to say about this film, the first screening of this film was at a European film festival. And it actually felt really bad to me. It felt very kind of improper and wrong to see my neighborhood kind of become European art cinema in this, just kind of big screening context and cinema and far from home. And I think after that screening, it's actually felt important to me to kind of think about this film as a film that I really want to share with communities that have kind of experienced these kinds of fires and you know, not necessarily local, but it definitely, I was also aware of the big fires that have happened in Boulder in your community. And yeah, so it actually has felt meaningful to me. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I also thought about that when I have kind of thought about where to share the film or how the film might circulate, that I have wanted it to kind of be a film that circulates more inside of communities that have kind of dealt with similar experiences. I don't think so. Yeah, these are my neighbors. My home was in this fire that happened in the summer 2020. We didn't lose our home, but we came very, very close to losing our home. So the fire was on our street. And so pretty much all of our neighbors' homes around us burned. And this is like a weird thing in fires, but kind of one house can be fine. And then like the whole rest of the street can be burned. So it's a little bit kind of random and also topographical and geographical, which homes are standing at the end. So we had smoke damage, but we didn't lose our home. And we left the community actually after the fire. So I didn't feel comfortable to live in the area anymore after the fire. So that was my home for 12 years. And then after the fire, we moved, still in Santa Cruz, but we moved into town and away from the mountains. And I think, you know, for me, making this project in part was kind of my own processing of what had happened. But I think also like in the immediate aftermath of the fire, like right after a natural disaster happens, there's a sense of like all of this media, kind of rapacious media descending and wanting content and ruins and disaster and people crying. And there's this kind of news agenda that then dissipates very quickly as people move on to the next thing. And I think I felt very aware because it was my own community that recovery, and even including my own recovery, psychologically we were evacuated for 2 months, and there was a long period where we didn't know if our home was okay or not. So I think I was aware of kind of this long duration of time that it takes a community to process and move through an event like this. And I felt like in that moment where people were just thinking about offering services or offering help, I felt like a thing that I could offer was listening, and kind of offering a maybe skill I have as a filmmaker or someone who listens as part of my work to just kind of make space for people if they wanted and when they felt ready. And that was definitely a negotiation with people of kind of when did people feel ready. and lots of people thought they felt ready and then didn't feel ready. So just waiting for the moment when people felt it would be meaningful and beneficial to share and be listened to. And I think I didn't think of it as a film. I really just was very focused on the process of kind of making space and listening and having these encounters where I would drive up into the burn area and be invited to people's land and spend time with them. And I think it took many months to even conceptualize that maybe it's also a film or an object that I might put out into the world. So really just at the end of shooting, I started to look at the material and think about if I would make something with it. But even I think I felt a little ambivalent about it as a public film that circulates. And I think it's, nice to show in a place like Boulder or to show locally in the Bay Area. But I think the audience is maybe really a community audience for this film.
Yes, it feels like this for sure. I would like to also ask a question to Max here, and then we'll open up to the public. And I'm wondering if this piece, Max, is part of a bigger research of yours, and if you would like to contextualize it and talk about your research and your interests, and also how did this project emerge? Like, where did the idea come from, even initially? Did you encounter the place, the huge building, or where did it come from?
So I'm a MA student.
Yeah.
And so the majority of my work is actually written and academic. And the source that you see, Louisa Moore, I use some of her words in the film as well. That's kind of a primary source for my MA thesis. And this comes from a very early period in that process of choosing sources. And she makes a number of comparisons that I think are really interesting. The one that you see here is thinking about the cloud as a literary metaphor, and using the actual history of scientific study of clouds and precipitation to follow that argument through. And through that book, I also got interested in data infrastructure. There's kind of another side to the problem of data infrastructure and its unseen quality that artists often draw upon, which is surveillance, oversight, the idea that these buildings are kind of black boxes that we have no image of what goes on inside of the actual servers. But they see us. And so she's trying to kind of go beyond that black box. And so I got interested in data centers, how they work, what they look like on the inside, and watched a number of films that I thought might tell me something about them. And finally just decided that I was going to sort of start maybe like seeking out their services just to see what that would be like. And so I found this one, and I didn't get any responses from them, but I just drove out there and started exploring the area, and found that there was something about it that really spoke to me because it is built on a former Air Force base. So it's actually federal property. So there are a lot of restrictions around filming there. And in a way, what I saw is that there are restrictions around being there as well. The only people who went into the actual business park appeared to be people who worked there, or military who were training in that area. They use it for that a lot. Yeah, so it kind of comes from that exploration of going to a place where I expected to find like not being able to see anything, and finding that what I could see sort of spoke to that not seeing, if that makes any sense.
It does, for sure. I mean, your films are very different, but at the same time, they're in the same program. And I feel there is a conversation talking about, seen, unseen, what is to be found, what is, but also like, talking about the physical and the materiality versus the virtual and the data. And but you also focus a lot on the structures, right? On what the material part of this virtual world, the cloud, that we have no clue how it looks like most of the times, and people don't know where their data goes to, or where you store or storage something, a picture, or so. Just making it all tangible and visual is important. I would like to open up to the audience if you have questions for any of the two artists here present today.
Thank you both for your films. Max, quick question. Ben, I'm assuming, is related to you?
Yeah,
and did the
that's
music.
my brother. Yeah.
Okay. Is what came first? The like glitchy synthy music or a concept? Were those in dialogue, or did you just sort of take music and use it for the film?
So his music was made first, and I listened to his music and he shows it to me. And I made this film and actually asked him for some music afterwards. And so this is kind of what he offered to me. But I feel like we were very much in conversation on this because we're kind of at that right age where he was developing intellectually right when I wanted to soak up everything that he was reading and doing. And his interests are philosophy and science fiction. And he's kind of an expert in the idea of the monstrous or the monstrosity. That's what he wrote his thesis on. Not necessarily related, but anyway, he offered me a lot of kind of science fiction books, philosophy books, including Donna Haraway, which is a big influence both on me and also on Louisa Moore, whose work I use here. And so there was kind of like a thinking together happening, I guess. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the filmmakers for these fantastic individual films, but then also, I guess this is a compliment for the programming team too. I mean, I think each of the pieces was strong on its own, but the combination and the sequencing of these really sort of generated a kind of a larger conversation, which I thought was so fantastic. And so whether it's the filmmakers, because I know like Irene, you're also an academic, or Louisa and the Mimesis team, I feel like culture is sort of increasingly sort of moving us towards sort of experiencing on one level we have more access than ever, and yet there's sort of this isolated fragmentation where we experience things in bits. And aside from this or the film festival, they're kind of increasingly are sort of rare opportunities, or somehow this felt viscerally different for me to actually see a series of short works in sequence and in conversation. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts or strategies about how we kind of take this sort of experience and extrapolate it out more culturally.
I mean, for us, speaking for all of us, we watch a lot of films, and then when we think about the programs, first of all, we respond to individual films, and then we choose the films that we like, and then we think about the conversations. And these films shift a lot in different programs, and there are different conversations that could happen. So eventually, it's a matter of just like thinking about it, watching, thinking how it works, and then maybe shifting things. And we do this for a couple of weeks. But yeah, to answer your point, I think it's hard, right, to bring a content like this into the big world, or to create more opportunities outside of the classroom or outside of a film festival. because it doesn't depend on us 100%, though we have access to social media and we can do these things on our own, but still people, yeah. I don't know, I don't have an answer to this. But I think it matters. I think each one of us could do it on our own, and hopefully eventually some changes will happen. Yeah.
I just want to say I've been watching a lot of the films at home, and I've been really appreciating just the spaciousness of the programming. And yeah, it does feel different from a lot of festivals in the documentary world that I think are a little more instrumental or a little more oriented toward the industry. But I've appreciated it also.
I was just gonna add.
Yeah,
Sorry,
please,
I'm jumping
Sarah.
in.
You can come in. You can come here.
No, I'm staying up here.
Sarah is talking.
I was just gonna say to that, like, how can, maybe extrapolating out. I think works like Irene's, which are really like rooted in a community, maybe is a good way to start that. Oops, sorry. Right, like more community oriented work that makes sense to organize local interest around or local screenings around. And then when you combine those more community oriented pieces with other works, I think people maybe can access them through the things that feel relevant to their communities. So yeah, that's and I think, we would really like to move ourselves in that direction too. And so that was my comment. Now I have a question for Max. I would like to ask you about your properties.
The seismic ones. Well, I took that from their advertisements. Ask about our properties, and then it's just this like white kind of like reflective room, which is completely unlike its surroundings. Speaking on the community orientation, one of the great pleasures of filming this was just getting to know the guy who lived across the street from the data center. He would come out when I was filming a specific shot in a specific area, like including the one towards the end. And that's who I'm speaking about. And yeah, we had these interesting conversations about the kind of encroachment of McClellan Park on the neighborhood in a way that it hadn't been doing when it was just an Air Force base. And I think that there's kind of a lot more there that I may go back to because that vacant lot is likely to be something else in the next, 10 years or so. And these are properties that I kind of want to follow through on, like to keep identifying them, because a property is a way of describing something, not just a way of owning something. So that's kind of a subversion or a transgression I was trying to make.
Yeah, I liked the repetition of that a lot. And I guess I also connect it to like, again, I like the way you talk about B-roll. We were talking about that the other day, but so like as filmmakers, we think of our images as our properties, which when you're like utilizing appropriated material or stock or, looking for images of these places that are not very often imaged, I think that word property has even more kind of meaning. And then I had a question for Irene too, but I don't want to monopolize it. So does anyone want this mic?
I have a question for Max, just to kind of keep the analogy to filmmaking going. This is really a hot mic. So yeah, I'm interested in the kind of peculiar temporality and passivity of observation represented by the data center. And from a filmmaker's perspective, we're like if you make the connection to like observational cinema, like materially you have a shooting ratio problem, right? With not only in terms of like just the scale of information that's being gathered passively by these data centers and collected, but also the material stakes of keeping that data alive. I remember, I'm old enough to remember, people freaking out about whatever you put on the internet's there forever. And that's clearly not true. It disappears all the time. Can you talk a little bit about like the content that is being gathered and the relationship of that to the kinds of coherence that maybe a story tries to bring into the world? Is there a relationship there that data centers are being a little bit utopian in the idea that they may be able to use this data? Sometimes I just feel like they're soaking up garbage, right?
Yeah, I think that you make a good point. And that was something that I'm thinking about here. There's kind of this utopic vision in the schematics that I used and in those properties that they're selling of infinitely accessible and infinitely useful data that's driving, innovation. And instead, I would say that data structure is something that we're navigating with our bodies, with our thoughts, with our emotions. The film before me made that important analogy that increasingly people are considering their emotions data. And so I guess in that way, I wouldn't call it like garbage, but it is an impossible place. It is an impossible dream that they are selling to us. Yeah, does that sort of answer your question or get close? At great cost. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes, exactly. I thought you meant that I answered your question at great cost. I'm like, okay, you're not wrong. All right. Yeah, it is at great cost ecologically, and that's kind of why I put that. That's why the properties of this data center are seismic, even in that green area where seismic activity is lower than the rest of California and the rest of Sacramento. That's the image that you see, and one of the properties that the data center sells to us, that this will be permanent because it will not suffer an earthquake. But if it's contributing carbon, then it has a seismic property of its own.
I have a question for Irene. So you visited in a particular time of grief for your community, and I'm wondering if you've thought about making more work or revisiting, or if you have revisited at a different time in these lives, in these people's lives. Oh, and I'm also curious how long after, maybe it was said in the film, how long after the fire were you able to begin these interviews?
Yeah, I haven't filmed more. I think if I were a different kind of filmmaker than I am, I would still be filming. There's definitely like a kind of, if I were the kind of maker who made kind of social issues driven observational film. There's like certainly a really interesting film to be made that would follow like in a much longer duration, the rebuild process, and like the community is still really struggling and not actually able to rebuild. So there's been, I think, 11 rebuilds completed out of 900 burn homes, and it's 2 years out. So there's been many kind of narrative plot points along the way in terms of like the kind of policies and kind of just difficulties that people have had with rebuilding. And some people I think have like finally given up and are selling their land and moving on. So I think there's definitely something interesting there. I think that wasn't my interest in it. Like for me, it really was about holding space in this particular moment of grief and kind of providing that kind of space of listening and care for people. I found it very hard myself to make the work and to spend the time and to be on the land that was burned. It felt very, very close to me, and actually was hard for me to do every time I did it. So it also didn't feel like when I felt like I had reached the conclusion, I didn't feel compelled to keep doing it just because it was hard for me, and like I felt like I needed to also move on. And this project was made in the middle of a longer feature length project that I'm still finishing, and so it was also kind of a COVID project that I was making during a time when I couldn't kind of get to the bigger project. For a number of different reasons, it felt like I just needed to stop where I stopped. But absolutely, I think there's all kinds of much bigger issues that could be very interesting to follow over time. And I think film, someone made a Paradise film that does kind of do that follows it like from the fire to the rebuild. So I think that kind of work is out there, and it didn't necessarily feel like I needed to do that. In terms of the timing, so the fire was August, and we were all pretty much out of our homes for 2 months before we could even go back to look at our properties and see what condition they were in. So I think October was kind of when we were back, and maybe November was the first shoot that I did. And then I filmed until the following spring, so kind of November to May.
Irene, I'm wondering if your neighbors watched this film, if you shared it with the community.
Yeah, of course. And I think I really thought of this as a film I was making kind of from within and for that community. The first screening of the film, and it was quite moving. It was also my first screening that happened at all in a long time, because all of this was during COVID, when we also kind of were not having in-person screenings. So this summer, after I finished the film, at the 1 year anniversary of the fire, there was a big community event that was outdoors at a kind of big inn that's in our neighborhood that wasn't destroyed by the fire. And everyone showed up, and it was a really long, very long day. It was like speeches and community events and like a band. And then almost the last thing was we did a screening of the film, and it was totally DIY kind of community screening where I had to run my own projection and run my own sound and bring my own screen. But everyone who was in the film was there at that event, and I got to watch it with them in a community. That felt very meaningful to do that with the film. But also it was hard, it was very hard for some people to watch. And I think that's also important to say. So I think as much as it felt meaningful to people who participated, a lot of people in the community were like, we just want to listen to a band or like have a nice day, and we don't want to, like, it's hard for people to watch those images, I think, within the community still. So it was screened in the community, but I think it's also a hard film for people.
Yeah, for sure.
Max, I have a little question for you. I was really struck by the tension between your imagery, which looks very, very corporate, very perfect for the most part, and then your wonderful voiceover that's very critical, and it's also really beautifully delivered. I think that is your voice, isn't it? That is really close. It feels very close. It feels very personal, unlike in a lot of those corporate videos. And I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit about that tension, and also about your choice of images and your editing choices. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that voiceover was very much something that like developed over the course of the production. Like I would shoot some, collect some images, and then record a voiceover kind of responding to those images. And so I think that accounts for some of like the roughness or like the contrast between the corporate and the very like closely recorded type of a voiceover. I also had spoke about this the other day as well. I kind of started thinking about this as like a sort of parody of a detective story in which the detective has no idea what's going on. And that's me. And so the voiceover is obviously a tool in film noir. And I recorded much of the voiceover in the hotel that I was staying in, which is on McClellan Park. And I was staying with like, you know, it's filled with like police officers who are there for their training. So that's kind of where that idea came from. And that's also why it's recorded so close to the microphone, because I was trying to block out some really strange and interesting sounds that still make their way in there, although I might be the only one who can hear them. Yeah.
I actually have a question bringing us a little back to Broderick's earlier point, which I think really resonates. Hello, Irene. Your film is, so Irene, your film is produced by Komsomol Films, right? So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the inspirations behind your work, the work that we've seen, the cinematic or maybe the socially engaged inspirations behind it. Because with this film and with previous films of yours, you are certainly thinking about other filmmakers who maybe resonate with you and who can maybe resonate with more people here in this room, and maybe they are also doing some of the work that Broderick is calling for, this kind of work that touches us maybe across generations or across borders. Maybe that's also a way to think of that. And then Max, after that, maybe you could also speak to the films that you had seen, because you mentioned that you had watched other films about data storage centers or the cloud before that inspired you. So maybe then we can begin to identify what our place is, starting from the people who have marked us maybe before with their work.
I get really stressed out by this question where I have to like list the films I like. I think because I'm a big cinephile, so the list is giant actually. Yeah, with this film, I don't know. I think this film happened kind of so organically, and it was a small project, so I wouldn't say I was especially kind of connecting to other work when I was making this. But certainly I think over a cycle of previous work. So the film I made before, the feature film I made before this film called Years in Sisterhood, I think was a film where I really fine-tuned some thoughts about listening and the way that listening could really like kind of be at the center of a work method. And I think with that film, I was really thinking quite deeply about a history of feminist filmmaking, and especially kind of 1970s US feminist filmmaking that I kind of rediscovered. I think these films have been a little bit more on people's radars in the past few years. I think there's been a few retrospectives and these films are collected, and I think they're on Criterion Channel now. But when I started watching these 70s films, they were films I had never heard of, no one had shown to me, and were very exciting when I discovered them. But really thinking about collective making practices, films that are centered on speaking and listening and testimony. I think I started making Years in Sisterhood and thinking about these ideas in an earlier moment in the kind of experimental documentary world where talking felt very out of fashion, and films were, I think the interview was really kind of dismissed as a kind of a bad or inferior form of filmmaking. And I got really interested in kind of reclaiming or making new space for films that are inviting people to talk, not in a way where people are kind of mind for sound bites, but where we're really making spaces that are listening spaces, that are durational and full and feel like encounters, that are actually letting people kind of come into thinking or come into new consciousness through the duration of speaking. So some of those films that I was watching are films like The Woman's Film, which is a newsreel film from the 70s, collectively made by 3 women. Janie's Janie, Joyce at 34, Growing Up Female. So there's a whole kind of cycle of films from the 70s that came out of consciousness raising groups that were also these very talky kind of political spaces where women were invited to just share and listen and make space for hearing about each other's lives in order to identify kind of patterns or structures or societal oppressions that were shared. So I think some of that work that's very oriented toward listening and making space for listening came out of kind of a really deep engagement with that work from the 70s. But that's just one thing. So I could talk for hours about other films I like, but that's maybe a useful reference to put out there.
I mean, I would just like to add that all these things that you've just mentioned, listening, giving space, working with the community, they are also found in contents inventory. Yeah, I really feel like you give the time within a shot, and you spend time, and we can tell that you are there to listen and to let people share this at their own pace. So I was happy about that, to see that you gave that space and weren't concerned with duration. Yeah.
So the question is about what films did I watch that portrayed data centers?
Right, or that might have even triggered you or gotten you to act, to produce this thing in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think it starts in like kind of like what I was reading at the time, and the discourse around data centers is always between the visible and the invisible. And that's kind of reflected in these corporate videos. It's also reflected in like when data centers are portrayed on, say, like Nova on PBS or something like that. You're always seeing the, kind of this black box emphasizing the invisibility of data. Yeah, I found that these, and there's also the Werner Herzog film about data centers, which I'm forgetting the name of, kind of embarrassingly, but it's on Netflix.
Not Lo and Behold.
Yeah, I think it is Lo and Behold. Yeah, thank you. And not Grizzly Man. But yeah, I think similarly, he kind of emphasizes this like invisibility of it. And when I went there, what struck me is that, you look at this construction site from across the street, from a residential street, and it's, they're very much visible. They very much take up physical space. And we can look at them. They're not only like surveillance operatives. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of other films that I was thinking of at the same time, like Harun Farokhi, I was watching a lot at that time. So As You See was one of the ones that influenced this a lot. This like history of sight in relation to the photograph, and also like the colonial gaze. I think that that's something that doesn't really show up like visibly in the film, but more kind of, you were asking like other projects. I kind of want to speak in another film about a different property, which is the property of zero emissions, which a lot of data centers are now just claiming. And I have a contact I've been talking to for a long time who's he's an IT expert who worked for Comcast for a long time, but he's since kind of moved on from that. And he was telling me about the metrics of zero emission in data centers. And it's very technical, but in short, them saying zero emissions largely depends on what metric they're using from what part of their facility. So, I mean, these are kind of the questions I'm thinking about. I hope that answered the question somewhat.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming to Ctrl+S. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.
Please come to the Artist in Focus screening this evening at 8 p.m. Ivara Divojevic will be here presenting Aleph. And yeah, that's it. Take care. Thank you.